If you want to.
I can read it on the computer.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, I call this November the 20th, 2025, meeting of the Salina Board of Zoning Appeals to order. I ask staff if the Kansas Open Meeting Act required notice has been properly provided.
Yes, I can confirm the packet was posted and the required notice was provided.
All righty, thank you. Roll call.
Board Member Bowden. Board Member Mike Sell.
Here.
Board Member Creer.
Yes.
Board Member Baker.
Here.
Board Member Hardy.
Here.
Vice Chair Tro.
Here.
And Chair Owens.
Here.
So it's 6 out of 7 members. We have a quorum and we can proceed with business.
All righty, thank you. We move on here to the minutes. Any changes anybody wants to make? I would take a motion if not.
I move that we approve the minutes as presented.
I'd second that.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to approve the minutes as printed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Okay, it passes. On to new business. Application V25-8. Look at staff.
Thank you, Board. So this application is the former H.D. Lee complex where the H.D. Lee hardware store was at the southeast corner of Elm Street and Santa Fe, shown on your screen there. So the H.D. Lee project, or the complex, was originally constructed between 1905 and 1928 and was the site of H.D. Lee's hardware business and operations. In 2008, the buildings and the property were recognized on the National Register of Historic Places, and in 2022, the same applicant that's bringing this item before you, who is Austin Cack with Overland Property Group, they applied for 2 variances. Variance case V2212, which was a density variance to allow 43 units per acre, or to go from 43 units an acre, which is the maximum in the R3 district, which is the regulating district in the C4 district for residential housing, to 92 units per acre. Additionally, there was a parking variance for the off-street parking that was part of a variance request V2213, which was a variance of 36 spaces to go from 106 off-street parking spaces that were required to 70 off-street parking spaces required. And currently, the applicant and his team are working on what they call phase 3 of the H.D. Lee project, which is shown on the screen circled there by Mr. Roberts. And that particular phase was proposed to have 32 dwelling units in it. And due to some financial limitations, they're proposing to go from 32 units to 37 units. And that's an increase of 5 units, which would bring the total units for the complex from 135 all the way up to 140. And so that increase in units increases the density. It also increases the required off-street parking. So that's the quick background. So what we have today is we have 2 applications. One is a variance to the density of the complex, and the second is a parking variance to the required off-street parking for the property and the project. So the first item we will address is V25-8, which deals with the density. And the C4 district, as I mentioned, follows the R3 density requirements and the R3 district bulk regulations for residential development. And the R3 density requirements have a maximum of 43.6 dwelling units per acre, and what is being proposed is 96 dwelling units per acre. Again, in 2022, the Board of Zoning Appeals approved a variance to allow for a density of 62 dwelling units per acre for this 1.47 acre site, and we are increasing the density with this proposal from 92 dwelling units per acre to 96 dwelling units per acre. Looking at the uniqueness of the property, the applicant states that this particular property is one of the few multi-story buildings that have residences in the downtown area, and that the dimensions limit the redevelopment and flexibility and the adaptive reuse because of the multiple levels that you have. You naturally have a higher density for development because of the multiple stories that you have on a single zoning lot. And they also point out that the density supports beneficial community use in the historic structure. So staff would agree that the buildings are unique and they are more vertical than most buildings, particularly in Salina. And unlike typical modern garden apartments, they are more vertically designed versus horizontally designed. And that multi-story industrial conversion is rare and is a valid basis for uniqueness in this case. Looking at the effects on the neighboring properties, the applicant states that there's no change to the exterior of the building or the existing footprint, that the change is an increase in density, taking the same space and going from 32 plan units to 37 plan units, and that adjacent properties will experience no physical impact from the proposed change, and that residents knowingly agree to parking limitations typically found in historic downtown living when they sign up to live at the Lee complex. Staff would agree that adding the 5 units would continue to activate the downtown, bringing positive economic and social activity to the downtown area, and that the 1.47 acres would have more benefit to the proposed redevelopment of the Building 3 or Phase 3, and then it would detriment from the development of Phase 3. So no negative impacts on the surrounding area should be anticipated. In looking at unnecessary hardship, the applicant states that a reduction in the density would jeopardize financing and render the project infeasible, particularly regarding Kansas Housing Resource Corporation's funding requirements that they have for the project, and that restricting the development to the 32 units that have already been approved could potentially leave the third building vacant and the project unviable. Staff would recognize that renovation costs are high and that density is needed for feasibility of this project, and that limiting the property to 135 total units could impose a financial hardship and limit the housing output of the proposed overall project. Effect on the public health, safety, and welfare. The applicant states that more residents enhance the downtown's viability. So the more people you have living in the downtown, the more that enhances the viability and vitality of the downtown area. And the project meets all life safety requirements, such as building codes, fire codes being sprinkled, things of that nature. And that the project provides needed housing and preserves a historic asset that the community has. So with the Lee buildings being historic property, keeping them viable and occupied is important to preserving that historic asset. Staff would agree that the entire project will be sprinkled, and we'd also agree that adding a diverse mix of residential housing in the downtown area is a positive for the downtown area and its vitality. And we would also recognize that converting vacant industrial property into active residential use benefits the welfare of the public at large. Looking at conformity with the spirit and intent of the ordinance, the variance previously was granted, and this would be a small modification to that accepted and approved variance by the board in 2022. And the applicant also points out that Salina rarely has high density historic loft housing, and that the ordinance should not discourage adaptive reuse. So the density ordinance should not discourage adaptive reuse of downtown structures, particularly ones that have a vertical orientation to them and are by nature more dense. Staff would agree with that assessment, and that the downtown is intended for higher density residential development, and the R3 regulations already allow higher densities compared to other projects. And the proposed density is consistent with the comprehensive plan and the downtown objectives of bringing people in high-density residential situations to the downtown area. So the board has the following alternatives that staff has identified. Number one is to approve the density variance as requested, which would allow up to 96 dwelling units per acre and 140 total units for the Lee Lofts property and project. Number two is to approve a lesser density variance requiring a unit reduction. Number three is postponed for more information. Number five is postponed if the findings of fact cannot be made to support the proposed variance that would increase the density from 92 dwelling units an acre to 96 dwelling units per acre. Staff would recommend option one, which is approval of the density variance as requested. And we have some suggested findings on page 7 for you to consider or use to make any kind of motions or approvals. With that, staff would take any questions you might have.
All righty. Do we have any questions for staff?
Does the request for density and off-site parking match the level that was approved in the 2022 variance? There's more that's requested, but just as a comparison of the existing with the new.
Sure. So this particular increase would go from 92 units per acre up to 96 units per acre. So because the density limitations are ratioed by acre and we have almost approximately 1.5 acres, it comes out to, even though it's 5 units that we're adding, it comes out to a difference of 4 units per acre, if that gives you an idea of what we're increasing. So the proposal is pretty minimal, if that's what you're asking. Like, we're talking 5 more dwelling units and 4 more units per acre. I mean, we already have 92 is very dense for Salina. In some communities it's not, but that's because we don't have a large urban center with a lot of housing. Most downtowns that have urban housing are going to have higher densities than that. But for Salina, this is higher. This is one of the highest. It would be up there with the Johnstown Towers as in terms of the highest density that we have in Salina. But again, that's a more vertically integrated type of residential setting, and so that's where you get the density from.
But it wouldn't be necessarily the density contributing to, people circle the blocks looking for a place to park and they can't find a place.
Yeah, so the second item deals with the parking situation. I will just hint ahead to that in that the applicant is here and they've done an analysis. In 2022, they did an analysis, and they're here to speak on the present as well. But for the most part, a lot of their residents don't actually have cars, and that's one of the advantages of living in a downtown area is you have the ability to walk a little more. You have public transit that's more easily available. Things are more dense and more walkable. But they can speak to that, but historically they've have about a 50% occupancy, if you want to call it occupancy rate, of their parking lots being used. So their parking lots are usually about 50% full historically is what they've indicated to us.
Okay.
I won't ask that later.
That's fine. Just giving you a quick preview.
All righty. Anybody else? No? Okay. Would the applicant want to make a statement?
Yeah, just real quick. So my name's Austin Cack. Business address is 250 North Santa Fe, Salina, Kansas, 67401. So the back side of the second building. I think Dustin did a great job of kind of highlighting the changes from the original one. I think just a little bit of backstory. So in 2022, we were planning phase 2 and phase 3 at the same time, and the goal was to set up all of the approvals to where we wouldn't have to come back when we were ready for phase 3. But 2 things kind of changed from 2022 to now. The first one being, originally we had been in communications with the Chamber of Commerce about a business incubation opportunity that they were trying to get off the ground. And so we had set aside a portion of the third building for potentially allowing them to have some sort of incubation space for small businesses to come in. That kind of fell through. In the time period between 2022 and now. I don't know if they found another space to do it, but it just didn't ultimately end up being the best fit. So that was kind of the first change, and then the second change, which was kind of alluded to as well. So this development participates in two separate programs that are administered outside the city of Salina. One is a housing program through the Kansas Housing Resources Corporation, and then the other is a program aimed at revitalizing and rehabilitating historic buildings across the country. So in 2022, when we had submitted our original plans, with the incubation space kind of set aside, and then additionally kind of with market conditions at the time, we had presented 32 units to KHRC. In the years between, there was a shift in the way that they look at some of these applications, and so it was kind of a mutual decision to increase the density in order to meet the requirements of their program. So the real change between the two layouts of the building is really in the unit mix. It's an existing building, so you're kind of stuck within the footprint of the building. Really what ended up happening was that a development that I believe was only 1 and 2 bedroom units before, we shifted some of the unit counts to add studio apartments instead of having a full set of just 1 and 2 bedrooms. So, studios are typically a little bit smaller. The building footprint remains the same, and so you're able to get a few more units in there, kind of across the board. So that's the history behind the original approval, and then the request at this time. We had hoped that we were able to kind of have this done administratively, but I think just given the changes, we wanted to make sure that we did it the right way. And so bringing it back in front of you guys to kind of consider and make sure you guys were comfortable with it was the way that we elected to do things. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have, but I just wanted to give a little bit of the transition and the backstory around the whole request.
All righty. Any questions? Go for it.
What is the timeline for your construction?
So we're pretty close. We have drawings that have been submitted to the city, so we're waiting on formal approval of the variance. But our plan originally was to try to get closed by the end of this year. I think it's going to be pretty tight with Thanksgiving and Christmas and all of that, but we're pretty far along. I think if things go well for us, we could be under construction in mid to late January.
Austin, this isn't really germane to the
Yep.
density issue, but how's your occupancy rate in the existing?
It's great. So one of the requirements for the housing program for phase 3 is that you have to demonstrate a waiting list of at least the same amount of units that you're proposing. So we had submitted phase 2 with a full waiting list, which there's 50 units in phase 2. So the building that was just completed this past year had a full waiting list by the time that we were ready to open. And then by the time that development leased up to the time we put the next one in, it already had a full waiting list again. So occupancy's been pretty great. We were able to host the Salina Liberty this past year as well. They had a couple of their players stay in our facility, and so it's been received really well, and we haven't had really any issues with occupancy. I think being downtown helps a lot too. I think folks like living down there and having access to all the amenities and so on.
Great, thank you.
I know one side of your building there would be great during the parades, but that's just me. Okay, anybody else? That wasn't really a question. Anybody else have a question for him?
All right, thank you.
Alrighty, thank you.
Gage, if you could bring up
Yeah.
the aerial
Oh,
photo
sorry.
again, I was going to add just a little more context.
Yep.
So phase 1 is the very north building. That'll work. Phase 1 is the north building, and if you could circle that. So phase 1 had 53 apartments. Phase 2 is the second building, and that's the one that they have recently completed, and that had 50 units. And then phase 3 is the very south, and that's what we're talking about today. That originally had 32, and it's proposed to have 37. So that's kind of how the development has occurred in the 3 different phases. So when we say phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, that's what we're talking about.
Okay, thank you. Is there anybody from the public who wants to make a comment?
I would just note for the record that we do not have anybody from the public on Zoom. Mr. Owens is the only person on Zoom.
Alrighty. Okay. She doesn't count. My wife doesn't count. So, so just be you then. So, okay. Alrighty. I bring it back to the board for discussion, possible action.
I'll move that we accept application and approve application number V25-8.
I'll second that.
Okay, seconded. And let's see, we didn't have any special things on that,
Oh,
did we?
that's, okay.
Yep. No.
Good, okay. I didn't think so. All righty, it's been moved and seconded that we approve application V25-8. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed? Okay, it passes, thank you. Now we're on to application V25-10.
Thank you. This is the companion item that we alluded to in the first item in V25-8. So V25-10 is a parking variance request. Because we are adding additional units, the number of required parking spaces also increases. So in 2022, a parking variance was approved of 36 spaces to allow for a parking lot that would have had 106 spaces to be constructed with just 70 spaces. The increase of the 5 additional parking or dwelling units increases the required parking from 106 to 110, and the applicant's proposing to keep the same 70 parking spaces that they currently have for the facility, and they believe that those 70 parking spaces will absorb the original planned development of 135 apartments plus the 5 new that are being proposed. So the whole project being 140 units, they believe the 70 parking spaces would be sufficient. And the way that is calculated is the all-street parking requirements require 1 space for every 20 units plus 3/4 of a space for every additional unit for downtown apartments. All right, so the history, we'll skip over that because we've already addressed a lot of that, and get straight into the uniqueness, in which the applicant states that the density is significantly higher than typical suburban apartments, and the downtown constraints limit the ability to purchase or develop additional parking, and reusing historic buildings are limited by the site. In other words, in order to expand parking, they would have to acquire adjacent properties or properties in the area that are already developed and remove the buildings and replace those with parking lots, which they believe is unfeasible. Staff would agree that the downtown offers shared parking in public lots, unlike greenfield sites, and that the site constraints for urban patterned development create legitimate uniqueness. Looking at adverse effects on the neighbors, the applicant says that peak parking demands are opposite the surrounding businesses, meaning during the day when a lot of the activities in the downtown are happening and there's a lot of activity, a lot of the residents are at work and they aren't in the area. When at night things slow down, that's when residents come back and when there's more parking available for the residents of the lofts. Parking lots are currently only half full according to the applicant, and many tenants do not own cars or vehicles and prefer to walk and use public transit. Staff would agree that the nighttime overlap is probably minimized to pretty much operations like the VU and other venues that are nighttime bars or restaurants. A lot of the downtown daytime activity does change at night, and there is a slowdown, so to speak, of the downtown area that would reduce the kind of conflict that having residents in the downtown might have for parking and congestion. On-street parking is also available, as well as shared parking lots. They also could mitigate the impacts. There are a number of public parking lots in the vicinity of the Lee Lofts, and there's not any expectation of overflow conflict that would result from the proposed variance or requested variance. Looking at the hardship and unnecessary hardship, the applicant points out that there's no available land in the downtown core for additional parking to be purchased or leased, and replacing and removing existing infrastructure or buildings in the downtown area and replacing them with parking lots is not feasible. Staff would agree that the site conditions make it so that it would potentially create a hardship for the applicant if they had to remove buildings and add new parking in an existing environment. And without the variance, staff would also agree that reasonable redevelopment is definitely reduced for this property. Looking at adverse effects on public health, safety, and welfare, the applicant points out that the area is walkable because of the density, and that many of the residents do choose to walk and use public transit, and they don't have a lot of tenants that have, extra cars. So if you look at the parking lot, a lot of times it's 50% full. If you were to look at the screen right now, you can see the area that's east and southeast. That's their main parking lot, and you can see that even in that photograph, it's less than half full. Staff would agree that the downtown area has many public lots as well as on-street parking designed to support urban activity, and that overflow parking can be absorbed safely in the downtown area using public spaces and on-street parking. Looking at conformity with the general spirit of the ordinance, the parking rules ensure that adequate spaces are on that there's adequate space for properties in the downtown area, and density supports downtown revitalization, and the spirit of intent of the ordinance is not intended to limit adaptive reuse of urban properties. Staff would agree that the applicant's data shows that 70 parking spaces meets or potentially exceeds their parking needs, even with the additional units, and that downtown's planning goals discourages excessive off-street parking. One of the things that you don't want to have in a downtown area is mass parking lots, because it breaks up the walkability and the density of, and therefore the walkability and usability of the downtown urban core. We would also point out that there's city go in the area that supports flexible parking possibilities and potential for residents. There is a staff, or rather an applicant's parking analysis in your packet, which shows that in their research that a little over 50% have vehicles, and that many of the residents don't even have cars. That supports part of their argument for the 70 off-street parking spaces being sufficient. There's also 2 public lots within 600 feet of the Lee Lofts, and those 2 lots exceed 100 spaces if you add up the available parking. So there is sufficient parking for parking during the day, as well as overnight parking that would be permitted. There's also on-street parking along Santa Fe and 5th Street, which is part of the urban fabric of this area as well. So staff has identified the following alternatives for the board. You could approve the variance for the proposed 70, allowing them to have 70 off-street parking spaces. You could approve a partial variance, meaning requiring them to have more than 70 parking spaces, but less than the 110 spaces that are required. You could postpone for additional information, or you could deny if the required findings of fact cannot be made to approve the requested variance. Staff's recommendation is number 1, to approve the variance to allow them to operate with 70 off-street parking spaces, and we would have a set of findings on page 10 for you to consider for that. And we'll take any questions you might have.
Just before we jump to questions, just because I think it's helpful to show you where the existing 70 spaces are located. So there's, in this big main lot, there are 50 spaces. So that is the bulk. I guess this should be just east of the building 3 there are 50 spaces. To the west, across the street, across Santa Fe, there are 12 spaces in this lot where my cursor is. And then to the north of building 1, there are 8 spaces. So there are 5 spaces that are like pull-in spaces, and then there's 3 parallel parking spaces to the north of the building. So that is where you get your 70 existing parking spaces from.
All righty. We have any questions of staff? Okay, hearing none. It's your turn again.
Yep, I don't have much to add on this one either. You know, the real difference again goes back to, you know, 1 bedrooms versus studios. I think one thing to consider for this body is, you know, with a distribution of 1 bedroom and 2 bedroom units, your tenant population varies drastically between a studio. So most tenants that live in a studio, it's usually just one person that's in a studio versus, you know, a 1 bedroom apartment. There can be up to 2 people, you know, a couple live in there or something like that. So, you know, really, even though the unit count has gone up, really the tenant loading or the distribution of folks at the property really isn't going to change very much. And then to the point that was just made, the way that our site's set up is that parking is really kind of dispersed around the entire facility. So you've got some on the north side, the southeast side where the main entrances are for building 2 and building 3, and then you've got some across the street to the west. And then in tandem with that, there are public lots around the area. So, you know, we have a really good dispersion around the facility that has served us well. And I know it's anecdotal, but I was at our office this morning. I came in the morning and there were like 10 stalls in the back side of the building. So we haven't really seen major problems. We have instructed our property manager to disclose to potential residents, you know, you're living in a downtown area. There might be times where parking might be a little bit difficult if there's an event going on in the downtown area. I know with the marathon last week, it did fill up in our parking lot, but that is kind of the reality of living in a downtown area that, you know, from time to time, things will kind of congest our parking. And, you know, we try not to be, you know, too nitpicky on who it is that's parking in our parking lot. You know, with the marathon in town, there's tons of people around. We're not going to, you know, be real sticklers about it unless we have to. But we just like to disclose to our tenants that is a reality that you're living in a busier area. So that being said, I'm happy to answer any questions on this one as well.
We have any questions for the applicant? Okay.
Thank you.
Seeing none. All righty. Is there anybody from the public that wishes to comment?
I would just note for the record one more time, well, second time, there will be a third. We do not have anybody from Zoom from the public.
Okay. Okay. Mr. Owens, I don't want you to be left out. You got anything to say?
I don't have any questions.
All righty. I'll bring it back to the board for discussion. No discussion? Okay. I feel a movement coming here. Somebody want to make a motion?
I move that we accept application V25-10 to the requirements that we have stated.
All righty.
To interpret your motion, you're moving to approve the requested variance, the parking variance with the findings that are on page 10?
That we've discussed and approved.
Okay.
Okay.
Second the motion.
It's been moved and seconded that we accept application V2510. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed? Okay. I know one thing I didn't say because it didn't have anything to do about it. I remember when you were in here before, you were talking about across the street. And so I've kind of been watching that. That doesn't seem to be a problem for you, does it?
Yeah, no, honestly, it's kind of an interesting deal. You know, I expected that parking lot to be a little bit more utilized just because of the access to Santa Fe,
Right.
but it's probably the least utilized out of all of them. And you know, we haven't had a whole lot of issues with folks wanting that park at the VU, you know, pulling into that lot. There's the occasional car, but yeah, for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to be utilized.
Well, I
very enough.
remember that was one problem we had. Well, just people from the VU are going to want to park there.
Yeah.
So it didn't seem like there's been any problem with it. So
Yeah, and we have signage up that basically says, hey, this is for Lelof's residents. So, you know, unless you're living at the building, don't park here. And I think we do have the right to tow folks that do park there that aren't supposed to be there. So it is, you know, adequately marked to make sure that's the case. And I think the entrance, it probably will pick up with the third building or the third phase, just because the main entrance from that area goes straight across the street. So, you know, the folks that live on the first floor in there, they can go immediately across Santa Fe and they're right in their door. So
Right,
I think it'll
exactly.
probably pick up, but yeah, it hasn't been utilized too much so far. So kind of an interesting deal.
yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I said, I just kind of been watching that.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem to be a problem. Okay. We come to the point where, is there anybody in the public who wants to say something? And again, like I said, my wife doesn't count.
I would just note one last time, we do not have anybody from the public on Zoom.
Alrighty,
So-
thank you. Alrighty. So that means that we've come to the time when it's time for us to say goodbye. All we need is somebody to make the move that we get out of here.
I move we adjourn.
Couldn't get a motion on the other
I'd like to make a motion that we adjourn.
second.
I think, okay, that's been moved, seconded, third, and fourth. Okay, we gone.